Asia and the World, final project by Grant Zydeck. My main argument is that through technology, the West and the East have shaped and challenged each other's powers and views of technology's impact on the world. This is a general roadmap and overview of where this argument is going to take us, starting with an early history of imperialism in China, which brings us to the Opium Wars and how military technology impacted the East and the West, and how over the years this led to a shift from hard to soft power. And then I will highlight the formation and differing views of technology the West and the East have, and how these differing views affect modern medicine. This slide is primarily a background on how imperialism got started in China and in the East in general. So China began to be imperialized in the early 16th and 17th centuries by the West, and one of the first groups of people to imperialize them was the Jesuits. As you can see in this picture on the right, we have a high-up Chinese scholar, and this is the way that they would dress to signify their wealth and power in the social order. They wore colorful robes and were able to read and write and usually had wealth. The Jesuit priests, signified by Matteo Ricci on the left, decided to copy what they looked like in order to gain influence in their social system. Although the Jesuits took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, they needed to push their Western agenda and to quote-unquote spread the religion. And so they usually ended up betraying these vows that they took to church and God in order to work their way up and get things accomplished. On the left, we have a couple of quotes from Matteo Ricci's diary. First one, Chinese architecture is in every way inferior to that of Europe with respect to the style and durability of their buildings. This quote goes to show that the West essentially believed that they were superior in every way to that of China. Architecture was one of the many examples that Ricci brought up in his diary of how the West was superior to the East. Ricci concludes his diary by saying, "One may gather that from what has been said that there are numerous points of advantageous contact between ourselves and the Chinese people." It's interesting that although the West is better in every single way to the East, they still want to exploit the East for what it has to offer in order to make themselves more powerful. And so this leads to a long and sad story which leads to the Opium Wars. And so early on, one of the main forms of influence in China was Britain because they wanted to use China for its tea and silk. And what ended up happening is Britain ended up funneling a lot of their silver and money into the Chinese system, and they needed a way to get it back. And what they decided to do was start importing opium from India in order to get their money back. They got the population addicted to opium, and then the people had no choice but to keep paying the British for this opium. And this picture does a really good signifying of the horrible war that this was. On the very right, we have a big British ship in the background using steam power, while the Chinese ships were still using sails in order to navigate. And in the middle, we have a Chinese ship being blown to smithereens. And this does a really, really good job of showing that the naval power and technology that Britain had really shaped China's economy in the sense that Britain was basically forcing them into the opium and forcing them to trade with them. This technological power influenced China's influence and national image for many years to come. In the 1970s, which is nearly 100 years after the Opium Wars occurred, Lao Shi wrote a book called Cat Country. It was about a Chinese narrator who visited an alien planet which was supposed to resemble the Chinese people. These Chinese people were incredibly uncivilized and did not use technology in their society. This quote highlights how uncivilized they were. I had slept on the ground the whole night. I squatted down next to the tree to use the bathroom. My friend wore no clothes. This shows how the naval technology and military technology of each country shaped and affected China's entire history for even 100 years after the Opium Wars occurred. This also shows how, this specific example also shows how the differing East and Western technologies challenged and shaped each other's power and economy through trade. So as all this was going on, Japan was watching very closely what was happening to their eastern neighbors. They realized that if they wanted to stand a chance, they must militarize and industrialize as well. They started building up their military and went through significant cultural changes in their country. They got rid of their samurai class, which was a shock to their people and not taken very well. The samurai class was always meant to protect them and act as their military, but Japan knew that if they wanted to stand a chance and remain an independent country, that they must make these changes. They were the leaders of a movement called Bye Bye Asia, which was this shift from not being industrialized, you could say, and forcing their own culture to become more industrialized and technological in order to compete with the rest of the world. This eventually leads to what we call hard and soft power. Many Asian countries try to industrialize and compete with other countries around the world in this way, but they realized over a very gradual period that it was more advantageous for them to influence the world in different ways. Hard power is considered this military power where countries can influence others through their power and influence in that regard, while soft power is a country's ability to influence others through their cultural attractiveness. Over this gradual period of time, Japan and other Eastern countries realized that it would be easier for them to be an influential country through their use of soft power. This change really began to occur after World War II and is still going on today. A really good example of soft power is a more recent work called Battle Angel Alita. One example of Japan's use of soft power is through their artistic works of manga, which is very artistic comic books, essentially. On the top right, we have what one of the comic books would look like, and on the bottom right, we have Hollywood's interpretation of it. Battle Angel Alita is unique because it was globally accepted and contains themes that are present in many other science fiction works. This allowed it to be accepted all across the world and for many people to relate to it, and one of the many reasons why it was a successful movie. This is one of many ways that Japan influences the world through their soft power. Another example of soft power, which I'll touch upon but not go into that deeply, is the movie called Hero. This movie is a Chinese movie, but is one of the ways that China has expressed their soft power to the world. They wanted to compete with Hollywood and create a movie that not only was entertaining for the whole world, but stayed true to their culture and meaning. They relayed many emotions through their use of color and was one of the first successful Chinese movies that really used intense CGI. This is one way that China exerted their soft power on the rest of the world and was influential. All this talk of hard and soft power shows how the East and West shaped each other in this regard of power. The West forced the East to industrialize and militarize, switching them from really what would have been more of a gradual change for them, but sped up their industrialization and forced them to go into hard power. And then they learned more on their own that it would be more accepted and advantageous for them to switch to soft power. The East and the West have very differing views of technology. This is very interesting to me because the West always used their power and technology in order to get things done around the world. Their technology was usually what allowed them to imperialize and abuse other nations. Even though this is true, most Western nations believe that technology is dangerous and can take over the world and destroy humanity. These ideas that they have are contained in the well-known movie Terminator, which was released in the early 1980s. In the top right, we have what is seen in the movie as one of the robots, and robots literally take over the world and destroy humanity. In the East, there's a very different approach to technology, which is actually more reflected through what happened with technology for them. They were forced into technology, the East was, but it helped them to remain independent and influential in the world. And in their view, technology and robots will harmonize and save humanity in the future. A good example of this is on the bottom right of Astro Boy. This has been a Japanese idea since the 1950s, and it's about a little boy robot who saves and harmonizes humanity and helping them in various ways. So this topic is very interesting to me because I was very involved in robotics in high school, and so I have definitely been molded into this Western perspective that robots are good and can help us, but they eliminate jobs for humans, and the population of the world is only getting larger, and so getting rid of jobs is not ideal. But I realize that I'm biased, and so I think that this Eastern view is very interesting and refreshing. I think it's important for both sides to take into each other's opinions and to use these when moving on in the future regarding technology. This relates to the thesis because the East and the West shaped through all the history that we've been talking about their views of technology today. And they have differing views of technologies, and I think that that their views challenge one another and can be learned from, and from each side can learn from each other. So I think that all of this relates to what I'm here at MSU for, which is pursuing a degree in physiology in order to be pre-medicine in terms of Eastern versus Western medicine. There is a plethora of medical knowledge and technology in the world today, and doctors are constantly communicating with each other from country to country to try and perfect treatments and remedies and medications to help as many people as they can around the world. And so all of this information is available to everybody, yet the East and the West have formed different views of what they believe is right. In a general sense, the East has more emphasis and stronger connection to spirit and meaning in relation to their culture. And this is really apparent in the visual that we have right here. On the left in the visual, we have Eastern medicine, which shows the body has a bunch of arrows and more herbal remedies. While on the right, we have Western medicine, which shows just the organs and the skeletal system and the stethoscope and medication DNA. And the Western view really only takes into account what is really physically there, what you can see, while the Eastern accounting takes a more deeper perspective and goes into the idea that there's a lot more that has to do with the human health and human body. In the West, health is perceived as just an absence of disease, while the East, there's a lot more that goes into it, and the doctor is meant to be a partner to the patient in order for them to be healthy. Here in the United States, we have two main types of doctors, DO, osteopathic, and MD, allopathic. Osteopathic tends to take a bit more of this holistic approach, like the East, in order to factor in mental health and other things, but really not to the degree that Eastern medicine does, while allopathic medicine is purely more research based and physical side. But I think that both sides can use technology to continue developing their approaches and should take both sides into account in order to um, get the best approach to help as many people as possible. So I really enjoyed this class and thank you for everything that I've learned.